All right, so in the last PowerPoint we discussed, or the last video that I made about this same PowerPoint, the 5 themes of geography, we were talking about the theme of location. We spent a lot of time looking at that theme actually, and we talked about how with all of the themes of geography, we're going to be asking ourselves a question to go along with it. For the theme of place, which is the second of the 5 themes of geography, we're going to be asking the question, what is it like there? What kind of place is it? Okay? And so, what kind of place is Aiken or Graniteville or the Valley? What kind of place is Augusta or Columbia? What kind of place is Atlanta or Georgia or South Carolina? So, really, when you look at place, you can ask yourself questions about a region, maybe questions about an individual location. Most of the time when people are talking about place, they're talking about characteristics of the place in which they interact with on a regular day-to-day basis. So, so maybe a cityscape or something of that sort. So you ask yourself, what is it like there? When we're looking at place characteristics or something that determines why a place is like, we're looking at oftentimes a combination of human characteristics, the main customs, the language, the beliefs. I've got a brother-in-law. He's about to be my brother-in-law, marrying my sister. He lives in Boston, and everything he says, he says it with that Boston accent. You know, like he'll say, I do a horrible Boston accent. Apparently, not nearly as good as I thought. But you know, things that might end with ER sound for us in the South might end with a sound for them, like the sprinkler, right? For example, we're going to look a lot more at languages. Customs are also another big deal. You're going to see different customs, different elements of one's culture from place to place that kind of gives us our definition of why a place is like. So oftentimes human characteristics tend to be very important, if not the most important part of how we determine what a place is like. And there you have some examples of people. You got this Muslim lady bound on that in a mosque, and you've got these individuals here dressed in their religious garb, and so we don't see a whole lot of that in the United States as much. But not to say that it doesn't exist. We do have Muslims and other faiths represented, but for the most part, we identify those cultures with the Middle East or with East Asia or South Asia. How many people live and work and visit a place also goes into the human characteristics, right? And you see cities are places where you have way more of that going on than you might in a rural area or even a suburban area. Even though I will say, for the sake of the class, that when we think about suburban areas, those are considered urban areas for human geography. So I might have mentioned it earlier, for the first time ever, we've got more people in the world today living in urban areas as opposed to rural areas and not being exclusively farmers. So looking a little bit further at the place values, or I guess the place characteristics, you got physical characteristics as well that go into, move my camera out of the way, physical characteristics that go into how we measure what a place is like, such as landforms, mountains, rivers, the climate, hurricane season. We got Hurricane, what is it, Bertha out there somewhere in the Atlantic. The vegetation, the wildlife, the soil. Okay, these are all things that we use to determine what a place is like using physical characteristics. Okay, you can even combine the two. What are some human? Well, I guess it wouldn't be a combination, because when you think about physical characteristics, we're thinking almost exclusively about natural things like mountains and rivers. But what about things that humans build, like buildings, okay, and things like that? Place names, looking at characteristics again of a place, how we define what a location is. You've got names given to a place, and those names are called that's called a toponym. This is a word that you need to be familiar with. Okay, toponym is not going away, and when you look at anything from a street sign to a city on a map, I challenge you to do that. You know, go on and look at a map somewhere and just look at the names of the cities or of the smaller towns and places all over the country, and you're going to see things named after Native American groups. You're going to see things named after American heroes or people like Martin Luther King Jr., for example. You've got the James Brown Arena in Augusta. named after James Brown. You're going to see other things named after celebrities, for example, and all over the place. So site is the physical character of a place. So all the things we've looked at so far have typically tended to be site characteristics, or things that we would use to characterize a place based on its physical character. Okay. Also, just quick commercial, for our upcoming test or quiz. Make sure to know toponym, site, and situation. Okay, these are all things that you're going to be responsible for. Physical character of a place, climate, water sources, topography, which is the physical terrain, soil, vegetation, elevation are all examples of site characteristics. So what about situation? Well, we already mentioned this when I was talking about location. I mentioned to you that situation is oftentimes the same as a relative location. So where is a place in relation to something else, relative to something else? So if you're describing where is the valley, you could say it is about 10 minutes to the, maybe not even quite that, to the east of the Savannah River, which would basically be 10 minutes east of Augusta. And that's another thing too, while I'm thinking about it. I don't want to draw out too long on this PowerPoint, but when you think about a place, for example, like again, if I'm talking to someone who is out of the state, who lives in Minnesota, I've got some family out that way. I don't tell them that I live in Aiken. I don't tell them that I'm from Lexington. I tell them that I live in Augusta. I tell them that I'm from Columbia. Why? Because those are bigger areas that people tend to know because of the influence of the larger area around. Lexington, to most people, would just be a spin-off, like a sub-part of Columbia, for example, if you're looking at someone that might live in another region or even in another country. So the next one, next theme, just that third one, human-environment interaction, very, very important. We're, in the midst of hurricane season. How are we going to interact with the environment when we have hurricanes going on? All right? How do humans and the environment affect each other? I'm not going to worry so much about you knowing human-environment interaction as cultural ecology, but we are going to look at some elements of cultural ecology, which is basically how we live with the environment around us. And so human-environment interaction is just that, and everything you're going to look at in some form or fashion is going to relate to how we interact with the environment around us, because we are earthlings from Earth, right? Obviously, we're going to manipulate the space to meet our needs as best as we can. We depend on our interaction with the environment. People will depend on the Tennessee River for water and transportation is one example of human-environment interaction. We modify it, okay? So we depend on the environment. We modify the environment. How in the world do we do that? Can we really change the earth that we live in? Of course we can. People modify our environment by heating and cooling buildings for comfort. Wow. Talk about a big deal in the American South. That's a lot of change, and brought people actually moving to the South in the early 1900s is air conditioning. It made it bearable, and largely it was very unbearable, and still could be very unbearable without air conditioning. There are some people that probably literally cannot live in the South if they don't have a way of heating them or cooling themselves. Up north, you've got extreme colds. I know, again, my family in Minnesota, they always they have snowmobiles like we have four-wheelers. So anyway, heating and cooling is a major way of which we modify the environment to meet our needs. We also adapt to it. Anybody ever watch the news or look at the weather.com app before you go outside? I don't. I probably should, but I'm way too lazy and too much of a guy to carry an umbrella. But what if it's raining outside? You're just going to get rained on, or you're going to carry something that's going to help you to adapt to the environment. In other words, an umbrella or a raincoat. All right. Even in the cold or in the heat, people wear shorts in the summer or coats in the cold to keep themselves warm. So these are all different ways that we have learned to adapt, to use, to depend on, and modify the environment in which we live. Right. The fourth theme of geography is movement. How are people, goods, and ideas moved from place to place? And ladies and gentlemen, I can promise that most of you probably will understand movement more than any other theme, simply because of this emphasis on the movement of ideas. Today, ideas get from one place to another faster than anything else you could possibly imagine, where it used to not be like that, all right? Or at least not in the way it is today. So we know how people get around, right? Humans tend to ride on trucks, trains, and planes, cars, bicycles, walking on college campuses. These are all different examples of human movement. Anything that involves people getting from point A to point B is an example of human movement in geography. Information movement, which is basically like ideas, travel through all sorts of different medium today. The phones, computer, email, snail mail. We still get that. I would personally like to, see everything arrive electronically unless you're expecting packages. I can't stand mail. But these, and what are some examples today of the information movement or even idea? Sometimes information and idea, I typically consider them to be about the same. How do these things get around? What about Twitter? What about Instagram? What about for us old dudes like me? What about Facebook, which 10 years ago wouldn't have been considered old dude stuff? So these are different ways that information today is going to be shared and expressed in ways that has never been able to be before. And every single time you get on and put some, whatever it is you're going to put on Twitter, you are exchanging information. You are engaging in geographic movement of ideas from place to another. And then another example of idea movement would be how do fads move from place to place, okay? And this is kind of getting us into the ideas behind diffusion, the diffusion of different characteristics from one place to another. Diffusion is a process of a characteristic spreading across space. And definitely need to make sure to know diffusion. We're going to talk about relocation diffusion, and then we're going to talk about hierarchical stimulus and other, just diffusion in general. Make sure to know about the 4 different types we talk about. So in order to actually understand better diffusion, we need to look at what a hearth is. And a hearth is simply the area of origin of an innovation or an idea or a religion or some kind of cultural concept. Okay? So hearth is simply an area of origin. So let's look at diffusion. A process of characteristics spreading across space. There are several different ways that things can spread across space. We're talking about from place to place where people are on Earth. Okay? The first way is relocation diffusion. This is a huge part of how things got from place to place historically. Right? The spread of an idea through the physical movement of people. And so, for example, Spanish-speaking culture in Miami, Florida, the spread of AIDS across continents is the one that gives you in the book. All right? The spread of AIDS is probably the best example of relocation. So the only way it's going to get from one place to another is by people transmitting it from one place to another. It's like almost like, well, people would move and migrate to cities. Some of those people that migrated to cities in the 70s, 80s, 90s would have AIDS with them, and they would bring it from one place to another, and then it would start in cities, and from there it might diffuse maybe contagiously. But for the most part, it definitely got to the United States and became an issue because of people moving there and bringing it with them. Okay, the Amish might be another example of relocation diffusion because once their land areas start to become overpopulated in places in Pennsylvania, for example, or in the Midwest area, they start to move a little bit further south and a little bit further west looking for land, all right? Because it's custom for them to give new, men, their sons and everything, a chunk of land for them to have their own farm. That's important in their culture. So those are examples of relocation diffusion. What's another example of diffusion? Well, expansion. So you've got relocation as one big part of the overall puzzle of diffusion, and then you've got expansion, which is the rest. But I'm going to tell you 3 specific types of expansion diffusion, and those are hierarchical, contagious, and stimulus, and they pretty much sound the way that they will look. Hierarchical means that you're going to have some kind of diffusion from a point, all right, or a node, a central point, and it's going to spread out from positions of authority or power. In other words, let's pretend that this position of authority or power is New York City, and let's pretend that we're looking at fashion design. You got runway models that are going to wear things that are created by celebrity designers, and these things are going to start in New York and nowhere else because they're brand new fashions. But then what's going to happen? Well, over time, you're going to see people start to take that fashion and go with it, and they're going to sell it in other big cities. So you see it's expanding from the authority place, the power position of New York into other cities. Then what happens is, other developers or other clothing designers start to get a hold of similar patterns, and they start making things based on that. And they sell it even cheaper to other smaller, maybe suburban areas, and that's where you're going to see things maybe making it to your mall stores, okay? And then next thing you know, everyone's partaking in wearing these different types of design clothes. That is hierarchical diffusion, and there's several other examples of it. Hip hop music, for one, starts in I believe in Manhattan and New York, somewhere in that area, and ends up diffusing from city to city. Like, for example, New York to Atlanta is another big place in hip hop, and then from there on down the line to even to the point where in the country everyone is familiar with and even listens to and enjoys hip hop music. Contagious diffusion sounds like it's contagious because you're sneezing on someone. All right. Now you've got a disease that I just now had. Well, that's contagious disease. Well, contagious diffusion works the same way. It's fast. It's widespread. The diffusion of a characteristic through population. Today, things can spread contagiously faster than ever because of the internet. Things like Twitter, things like Facebook, even things for what I do. Edmodo is a social media site that I use to become a better teacher. A huge amount of things, even making these videos and using them in the way that I am, is something that I've gained access to through contagious diffusion on Edmodo and other social sites. So it doesn't have to be spread through a social site. Christianity Christianity is a good example of all three of these different types of diffusion in some way or another. But let's say that you learn about Paul in the book of Acts, and maybe world history or somewhere. You guys we're going to look at Christianity, and it spread a little bit further in class. But it initially spread both hierarchically and contagiously as missionaries went from place to place, converting people that were not Christian, maybe people that were Roman pagans, into Christianity. And then finally, diffusion, stimulus diffusion, is probably the hardest to just understand, but the way it works is ideas that were not popular, in its original form, becomes popular later on. And it gives you the example of computers sold, but I'm going to give you a more specific example. We're going to look at the early wars between Apple and IBM computers. We're talking way back in the early 90s, all right? And the way it works is like this. We've got Apple was very, very inventive and created the graphical user interface, or GUI as it was later called, which is basically the ability to use icons to manipulate data. In other words, we all have a mouse. Here's mine, all right? And you double click on icons to open Microsoft Office, for example. That originated as an Apple idea, but nobody was really into Apple computers, and a lot of corporations and businesses had bought into IBM. And so what happens? Well, IBM takes the idea originated by Apple and goes with it, and it becomes popular through them rather than through Apple. So, we all know that Apple has picked themselves up, and even though they were recently on the top, now even there are more Android users on Earth. This just came out than iOS users. In terms of cell phones, but we all know that Apple has been very much a success story in recent years. The fifth, aren't we on number 5 of the 5 themes, is the element of region, the theme of region. We ask ourselves, how are regions similar to and different from other places? Now, we're looking at what makes this different than place value or place characteristics is we're comparing two places or two regions from one another. All right? So it's a comparison. In order to fully understand region, we have to understand the types of regions we'll be looking at. Formal regions are places that will have just an absolute known boundary barrier. It's just the way it is. There's no changing it. A functional region is something that works from a node and performs a function. In almost every case, Functional regions are going to be something that provides a sort of a service, like a TV provider. And then finally, vernacular languages are areas that are languages. I just said that. Vernacular regions are areas where the boundaries are disputed. So formal regions, uniform, complete. Everyone knows the boundaries. Functional regions they perform some kind of a function, normally some kind of a human service. And vernacular regions are based on one's perception. Sometimes you even see them called perceptual regions. I'm not sure which one the book uses, but I want you guys to know both of them, okay? So what are these things? Well, to look at a vernacular or perceptual region, a region defined by people's perceptions, such as what is the Middle East, what is the South? And you might say, well, look, Fowler, these things are actual, they do have actual set boundaries that people understand and know. Not really, because if you really think about it, what is the American South? What is the Middle East? Is it characterized mainly by its religion? Is it characterized mainly by the countries, the states that seceded from the Union during the Civil War? Some people might define them like that, but if you define the Middle East by religion, that means you're also including most of North Africa into the Middle East. But wait a second, isn't North Africa North Africa? But culturally, they're very similar to the Middle East, right? And then in the South, you've got this, the original states that seceded from the South, but some people might include Texas, for example, as even Oklahoma as part of the South, and you would see that there would be differences in people's idea of what the South actually is. And there's a page in your book that references that directly. Formal regions are regions defined by state governments or administrative boundaries such as states, countries, or cities. Pretty clear cut there. It's really easy to understand those as formal regions. But also, a formal region can be something that just has a beginning and an end that you can put on a map. For example, the Corn Belt. For example, the Rocky Mountains. Chinatown. All right, any mountain range or anything like a valley or something like that. These are places that could be considered formal regions. And then finally, a functional region is a newspaper service area or a cell phone coverage area, or probably the most applicable would be a radio station coverage area. I know that I used to drive from Lexington to Midland Valley whenever I used to teach in my first few years, and what I would do is I would get to about exit 22 on I-20, and then what would happen? Well, the radio station I was listening to would go out, so I would have to change it to another radio station in order to continue to listen to the radio. So those are examples of formal, functional, and vernacular regions, and here are some pictures of them. What kind of regions are we looking at here? Well, clearly formal regions, right? Because we're looking at the map of how we voted in the year 2012. This is at the county level. This is at the state level, and either way, you're looking at places that are exact, have exact boundaries, the states. Could you characterize regions by red and blue? Oh, maybe so, but we're not really looking as much at a functional region then as maybe a vernacular region. I don't know, that's kind of a stretch. But nonetheless, here is a good example of a functional region. What are you looking at? I'm not honestly sure exactly what you're looking at. I would have to imagine, though, that it's going to be either a newspaper or a radio service area. But I'll show you guys some examples of functional regions, and we'll talk about those more in class. And you guys have certainly studied all of these in class. And then finally, vernacular regions are going to be, well, look at this. While we have the American South, a lot of people are going to say that maybe Oklahoma isn't really part of the South. At least people from South Carolina, Georgia might say that. But then people in Oklahoma, some of them might identify more with the South, some of them might identify more with the American Midwest or the American West, and so it's kind of hard to see. And then Texas kind of considers itself to be its own country. So, how in the world are you going to remember these 5 themes? Well, it's only 5 themes, y'all. Come on. But if you want a cool little cute acronym or a way to really make sure that you remember, use Mr. Help. Looks like this: movements, regions, human environment, HE, there we go, human environment interaction, location, place. Alright, let me go back so you guys can see that in case you can't remember 5 words and 5 themes and 5 questions. We're looking at Mr. Help as the 5 themes of geography. and I'm not too worried about this assignment right now. If we do it, we'll do it in class. If you guys have any questions, feel free to contact me and ask me, or certainly take time in class to ask your questions. And you will have a quiz on the 5 themes of geography presentations that I've made, the 2 of them. And you should have a list of questions that I may ask you for this quiz. So make sure that you go through and fill out and make sure that you know what those answers are. If you have any questions, feel free to send me a text or some kind of notification to ask me your question. Thank you very much.